Have you ever been deep in concentration when you suddenly get jump scared by a knock at the door? And then it's just somebody trying to sell you something you don't need and you didn't ask for? Yeah, me too. So I made this. It tells people to go away politely. And check this out. It's a chalkboard. This was a pretty quick and easy project, all things considered, and I'll show you how I made it. To form the frame of our sign, I picked up some 1" by 2" whitewood board from the hardware store. And I've calculated the angles that I'll need to cut in order to form the corners of our sign. And I'll put those up on screen if you want to follow along. I only purchased one of these boards, so if I mess up cutting any one of these angles, it means a trip back to the hardware store. So to give myself the best chance possible, I'm going to whip up a quick miter box for the angles that I need to cut. And that way, if I mess up at that point, I guess the problem is just genetic. I'm going to be using recycled MDF to make the miter box, and that's just because I know it's so flat and straight, and I have a ton of it. And despite its obvious flaws, I have a ton of it. So it's really become a staple of my projects, of my diet, and in my eye. It doesn't really matter what size we make our miter box, but I am making it skinnier than a typical one. And that's just so that our 1" by 2" frame board thing isn't swimming around in there when we go to make our cut. In fact, I think the only thing that you have to worry about while constructing the miter box itself is keeping the sides super square, because that will affect our cuts later on. Once our box is complete, we just need to mark the angles that we're going to be sawing. And to do that, I'm going to be using a digital angle finder just because that's the easiest for you to see on camera. But my favorite tool to use for this is actually my grandpa's old analog angle finder. I'm not sure what this was. It looks like it was a combination square that lost its combination. But real quickly, I just wanted to mention that the difference between this analog angle finder, the digital one, and whatever crappy school supplies that you can rummage up is nothing. They all draw the exact same lines. Because I imagine the best tool for making a miter box is probably a miter saw. But if you have a miter saw, you don't really need a miter box, now do you? But I figure most people that have soliciting problems don't own a miter saw, and neither do I. So in addition to showing you what I did, I figured I'd give you a few options for stuff you might have at home. Using the stuff that I had, I also made a line straight down vertically from our angled mark. And this is just so that I can keep the saw aligned straight and vertical. From there, it's just a matter of using every trick I have to keep this saw from deviating off the path of righteousness that we've created for ourselves. Everything was looking really good from my end, and when I checked to see how righteous I was, the front side looked fine, but the back...
He's trying to lead you down the path of righteousness. I'm gonna lead you down the path that rocks.
So it's a good thing that was just a practice cut, and now that we're all warmed up, we're ready to do the real deal. The real deal, I guess, just being the exact same thing, except more carefully and more better.
That'll work.
A quick check of the angle finder shows that more better seems like it did the trick. So, with the 56-degree angle out of the way, we just need to repeat the process for the 34-degree angle. And because I constantly strive for authenticity, and for no other reason than that, I'm going to truly repeat the process by completely screwing up the first cut by about 3.5 degrees. So, you might be familiar with what comes next.
Shit, you already know I'm obsessed with it. I can't get enough. Back with another milk. Help! Help!
What I learned from my mistakes here is that I actually had the most success when I kept switching what side I was sawing from. And that way I could keep an eye on my vertical line and ensure that I was straight and narrow on that path of righteousness.
Figure that out on your own, genius?
Yeah, sure did.
Ideally, you'll have learned from my mistakes and you won't be in a situation where you have to cross out like half of your cuts for being too stinky. But it might be helpful to label which angles they are just so that you avoid mistakes.
I think it's a good idea and I'm standby.
Now, I'll be honest, that was far more work than I was expecting when I said I was going to whip up a quick miter box. But with that out of the way, we can move on to the meat of the project. And I'm going to start by making the frame. To do this, I grab a piece of our 1" by 2" frame and I make sure it's firmly aligned against one of the walls of the miter box. Then I go to make one of our 34-degree cuts. The cut is perfect thanks to our miter box, but I didn't realize I had already made a mistake, and you'll see what that is here in a second. From the base of the cut that we just made, I measure out 16 inches and make another mark. From there, I measure out another 56-degree angle and make the cut. Then, once that's done, we have one of 4 frame pieces that we'll need to make the border of our sign. We just have to repeat this process 3 more times. And I know it sounds cliche, but throughout the whole project, I really tried to make sure to measure twice and cut once. Sometimes I even measured 3 times. If I mess up cutting any one of these angles, it means a trip back to the hardware store. So you can imagine my surprise when I start to mark the very last cut and things kind of feel like they're not right.
What? Why does that feel like it's not gonna work?
Like it might be a tight fit.
Why does that feel like such a tight fit?
Then some learning occurred.
There's no shot, right? There's no shot. Oh no, I'm going to the hardware store. Oh no.
I guess what's the...
What I think I've just discovered is that you want your less extreme angles, your less acute angles, to be your end cuts, because this triangle is less surface area than this triangle. And so, since I have my 32-degree angles at the ends of my stock here, I have more waste. And I literally think that's the difference between me only having to buy one of these and me having to go to the store right now.
All right, so what was the difference? This much, like an inch.
That is the difference.
All right, well, that's gonna haunt me. I've returned with a board, but I could not film myself in the hardware store because there was a bunch of people there, and I'll be honest, it's so cringy to film yourself, especially in a hardware store where everybody's like hot and sweaty and like construction worker and everything like that. And I'm here with my dinky 1x2 board and I'm going to be sitting here filming myself selfie style. No shot. Sorry. After I cut up my new board, I could finally start to mock up the frame and see if there are any small gaps that we needed to take care of. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you look really closely, there is a little baby gap that we're going to have to take care of. I don't know if my frantic miming motions have indicated this yet, but we have a problem. The cuts we made aren't perfect, and by we I guess I mean me. The cuts I made aren't perfect despite using the miter box. And without going into what that might say about me, if I mess up at that point, I guess the problem is just genetic. We have some corrections to make. The cuts we made to form the sharp corners of our frame are far more accurate than the other 56-degree cuts that we made. And I know this because when I measure the angle of the wood pieces combined, the sharp corners are only ½ a degree off, while the other more obtuse angles are more than 4 degrees off. Knowing this, I've glued the more accurate corners together to use as a guide for correcting the less accurate corners. Now let me show you how I'm going to do that. It can be difficult to clamp sharp corners like this, so I'm going to be using masking tape for the job, and I'm going to be using it in a way where I anchor it to one side of what needs to be glued and stretching it over to the other side to make sure those two halves are pulled together. Once that's dry, we can come back with our straight edge and connect our 2 outermost points with a straight line. This will show us what we need to take away in order to bring the top and the bottom of our frame in line with each other. Then it's just a matter of using whatever tools you have in your arsenal to remove the marked area. I'll do this for both halves of the frame, and then they should fit together perfectly. You know, like how the miter box should have prevented me from having to do this in the first place. Once you've massaged the frame into some semblance of flushness, you can glue both halves together. I'm using tape to hold the two halves tightly together, and then I'm following that up with some MDF and clamps to keep the whole thing planar and flat.
You're flat!
These end results are probably completely unimpressive to somebody who's always owned a miter saw, but when you understand what we had to do to get to this point, the fact that it even kinda looks like we own one is amazing.
While I was out looking for cheap backing materials, I found out that you can just buy whiteboard material straight from the hardware store. And while that's not immediately helpful, it comes with blackboard material right on the other side. This ends up being cheaper than finishing ply of the same thickness, and it saves me from having to buy chalkboard paint. So all we have to do at that point is cut our frame shape out of the rest of the board. And since the angles of our frame have proven to be less than perfect, I think the most accurate thing we can do is trace the outline of our frame onto our board and cut it out. And that way it ensures it's as flush as possible to the edge of our frame. I'm going to be using a permanent marker to trace the outline of the frame. So I've covered the outside in masking tape so the wood doesn't get marker on it when I press it right against the frame to get as accurate a transfer as possible onto the whiteboard.
Now that I know where the edges of my frame are gonna be, before I cut it out, I drill a hole right at the corner, just to mark where it is. This way I can add masking tape to both sides of the board along the line that I'm going to be cutting. Then when I come through with the circular saw, the cut is much cleaner and there's far less tear out. When I was done, I wasn't in love with the look of the MDF being flush against the frame, so I brought it in another 1/4 of an inch. And when I did this, I used the offcut of the frame as a guide for my circular saw, and this made the cut much straighter, much cleaner, much easier. So I would suggest doing this from the start, both setting it in a 1/4 of an inch and using a guide of some kind for your circular saw, because man, oh man, that makes it easier. I think tucking this backboard material in just a little bit looks so much nicer. I'm going to be using several coats of tung oil to finish the frame, and I really like using this stuff because it's good weatherproofing, it's also insect safe, and it doesn't discolor the wood very much, so we get to keep that nice contrast between our light wood and the dark blackboard. After marking where I want to attach the frame to the backing material, I countersink some screws into place to attach everything together. With our frame and our backing material finally brought into we have ourselves a really nice chalkboard. But it's not about having a fun chalkboard.
It's about sending a message.
Hey, time out 1 second. It's me from the future. We're about to have a segment where I model and 3D print a bunch of letters that go inside of the sign, as if everyone has a 3D printer and that the big barrier to entry to this would be a miter saw. I didn't think about that at the time, and I'm sorry. So if you don't have a 3D printer, you might have to stencil in some letters or use a Cricut vinyl cutter or a 3D printing service or cut them out of wood, or you get the idea. I'll try to think about these things in the future, especially when I'm trying to frame the project as if it's the most accessible thing in the entire world. All right, thanks, sorry, bye. I took the font that I was using in the initial mock-up and I brought it into a free modeling program called Blender. From there, I used their text tool to recreate what I had made in GIMP, and I'll link the learning resources that I used on this in the description. From there, I just had to do a little bit of extra work to split the text up into multiple models so that it could be prepared for 3D printing. I exported all of the models individually as STLs, and I'll make those available down below in a link in case you want to use them freely in your own personal project. After slicing, we're ready to print. But even if we might be emotionally ready to start printing, the sauna-like conditions of my garage have never been too kind to the filament. So the first step for me of any project that involves 3D printing is dehydrating my filament in the toaster oven.
I think it's safe to say that our luck has officially turned around, guys. We are back, baby.
After breathing some life back into our filament, we can move over to the printer and finally print out our letters. It took me about 8 hours to print out everything that we're going to need, But if you have a more modern printer, that's probably gonna go much faster for you. To help arrange the letters, I draw some straight lines through the midpoints of the frame. This will just help me keep the letters horizontally aligned and
energetically aligned with me and this message.
Once I know where every letter is gonna go, I'm almost ready to glue them down. But if you used white filament like I did, then you probably have some of these little stringies that you're going to have to get rid of first. I went for E6000 to glue the letters down, just because it always stays rubbery, so I feel like it would survive getting hit by a chalkboard eraser or something like that in the future, where a super glue might be brittle and sort of unstick itself, if that makes sense. At this point in the project, I'm more than ready to call it done, but unfortunately it just can't hang. So if we want to display our standoffish masterpiece, we're going to have to hang it in some way. I was getting a little bit impatient at this point, so to hang it, I just picked some random points near the top and drilled some holes based on vibes. But that didn't really vibe with the mounting hardware I'm going to be using. See, this is going to be hanging on a brick wall. So to do that, I'm going to be using something called a brick clip. It wedges itself between the bricks so that you can hang stuff without having to drill into the wall. The brick clip ended up being a little bit taller than I thought it was, so you can see it poking up above the top of the frame when you hang it, and I don't like that. So I had to make this. Happy Batman. He allows the whole sign to sit just a little bit higher. It also grabs onto the brick clip and prevents the sign from rotating around when you're doing things like drawing or erasing the chalkboard. Okay, last order of business before we can call this done is to add some screws that are going to act as standoffs for our mounting hardware. By that I mean the brick clip has a little bit of depth to it, so unless we add some screws to counteract that, drawing on the chalkboard is going to be a wobbly, janky experience. Finally, behold, our finished sign and its human-repelling aura. If you're rocking a polo shirt and a Segway, your safety is not guaranteed around this thing. The standoffs were super necessary if you're going to be throwing any artistic action at this thing, which is what I intend to do, so let's do just that. For this first drawing, I want to bring the concept full circle and recreate the mock-up that I made in GIMP. I did the initial drawing for the mock-up with a mouse, so it's pretty simple, all things considered, but there is something that is so satisfying about taking an idea that you have and bringing it into reality. The chalk that I'm using for this is just a cheap set that I found from Crayola. The colors aren't quite as saturated as I was hoping they would be, but I have seen them in almost every store that sells chalk. I steered away from chalk pastels intentionally because I heard they could leave a permanent mark, but if you have experience with that, let me know. I also really want to hear if you end up making this for yourself. Links to everything I used will be below, and I sincerely hope it helps to cut down on all of those annoying visits. I'm looking forward to being able to change the sign for all of the seasonal holidays like Halloween and Christmas and whatnot. Since it's summer at the moment, I figure I'll leave you with a time lapse of what's currently on the chalkboard to ward away the current set of warm weather solicitors.
If this is your first time seeing my channel, hey, my name is Zach. Thanks for watching my video. If you're a returning viewer, you also had no idea who I was because I hadn't introduced myself, but you're also probably wondering where the heck I've been. I bit off more than I could chew with a project, and I kept doubling down on that commitment, and I should have been posting more regularly so that you guys can give me ideas and suggestions and all of that stuff and keep me accountable and on track. So let me know what you think I should do with all of that footage. Should I release it anyway, just what I have, and then maybe do a part 2 where I follow up and fix the issues? Because I've been beating my head against the same issue for months now, and I feel like I've just hit a brick wall. Those are lessons learned for the future, but I definitely want to be posting far more frequently than I have been. Till then, I'm already working on the next one. I really look forward to seeing what you're thinking about all this, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.